Hello, and welcome to the Albright Scholar for October 2020. My name is John Pankratz. I teach history at Albright College, and every month it's my privilege to welcome BCTV viewers and residents of Greater Reading to take a glimpse inside our learning community up here on North 13th Street, to look at the work being done by teachers and students, and to think about its impact on all of us. Well, it's October, although it feels like we've been teaching for a full semester already up here on our accelerated and compressed schedule during this pandemic. But I thought one good thing about coming to you via Zoom and having a little more flexibility about when my guests appear is that I'm able to catch up with some of my colleagues who live out of town and who might not be available at 9 o'clock on a Monday night to stick around. And so it's my great pleasure to welcome one of my closest colleagues and best friends, Guillaume de Sion, from the Department of History. Guillaume, great to see you via Zoom.
Hi, John, good to see you too.
Yeah, we actually do see each other because both of us are teaching mask-to-mask courses, at least some portion of which are live and face-to-face, and working with students. So we see each other here in Masters Hall several times a week.
That's right.
As well. Guillaume, you have not been at Albright as long as I have, but you've been here a long time, and you've developed a reputation as just a master teacher, one of the most admired scholars, one of the most level-headed colleagues that we have. So I'm really glad to talk about your work and to share it with this BCTV audience. So thanks for joining me.
I'll try not to disappoint anyone.
Okay, good. One of the things that I think makes you such a wonderful teacher is your very active research agenda. You do modern European history, you've written in the history of technology, the history of popular culture, really an astonishing range of topics. What sorts of things are you working on these days?
Well, I continue to juggle between, I have an echo, is that okay, normal?
I can hear you okay.
Okay, all right. Well, I like to juggle multiple things at the same time, and this means that, in fact, I'm quite undisciplined. Instead of focusing on one topic and actually digging to the bottom of it, as some of my colleagues in the field do, I am notoriously kind of the absent-minded professor. So someone asked me, would you like to do a topic on comics and aviation? And of course I jump to it, and then even a student comes to me and says, I'm more interested in doing a research project on that particular issue. And I'm so happy to just be asked that, of course, I jump into it. The result is that I do accomplish things, but maybe not the bigger projects that I had in mind. So I jump about. I'm still working on German history a little bit, but I have, as you noted, shifted a little bit more to history of technology, notably aviation. And I'm interested in the intersection of some of these realms, especially in the realm of culture. And there's a lot to be done in popular culture, the way people understand the technology, the way they apprehend it, the way they make fun of it. And so I've been able to focus a little bit on comics that way. Not American comics, that's a whole field that is intriguing but very difficult to master. I didn't grow up with American comics,
right?
So I focus on European ones.
Yeah, and that's and comics and bande dessinée in European cultures really occupy a special part of the culture, maybe even deeper than comics do in the United States.
You're right. It's quite astonishing. You go into any bookstore nowadays in France or Belgium or Switzerland, and you're going to have at least half a floor devoted to comic books. And these comic books are in hardback. They're beautiful, they're expensive, but people buy them. There's also a fascination with Japanese comics, and so all the mangas are translated into French. And so there's such a richness. I'll admit, in terms of my personal history, there's also a little revenge on my parents. I grew up in a very conservative household where my father believed strongly that comics were a threat to the mind of his children. And so I contended with parental raids onto my room to take all the comics I had bought. I got them back during vacation, of course, and the ongoing ballet was to try and like sneak them back from them, etc., etc. So it's my way of getting back at them in a friendly manner.
After your deprived childhood, you get to make your living by reading comics in a serious analytical way.
I would agree, exactly. Yeah.
Great. I think the range of your interests and what you call your distractibility is part an occupational hazard of being at a liberal arts college. We're not in tiny, narrow silos. You're not allowed to simply be the historian of Germany between 1910 and 1945. You've got a lot more ground to cover and a lot more interest to respond to on the part of students as well.
That's right. And it was something that both you and the chair of the department at the time, Barbara Fahey, reminded me of when you hired me 25 years ago. You said, you're welcome to focus on what you like, but we need you to cover beyond your realm. And so it became literally an illustration of the Plato tornado concept. So at 9 o'clock, we were talking about the Greeks. At 10 o'clock, I had Mao Zedong in China. And at 11, I got to finally talk about Europe. But it got me interested in seeing what the students also were interested in. And so I got into also some thematic courses. One of my very first thematic courses was on the space program. But then within 2 years, I was doing a course on the nuclear age. And it was, in fact, initially on the insistence of one of our students who had grown up near TMI and wanted to know more about the nuclear age. And so I said, deal, we'll try and develop one. And so it's on her insistence that I offered in 2000, I believe, my first course on the nuclear age, which has since become what they call a synthesis course at Albright.
Right, how great to take off from that student's inspiration, their inquisitiveness. I think those thematic courses are interesting because they really do allow you to synthesize lots of different kinds of evidence, lots of different kinds of reading.
That's right. It's the nice thing is that we can bring in poetry, we can bring in technology, political events. I do this, for example, in a course I just developed. I taught it for the first time in this module that just finished on World War I. And the challenge, of course, is taking in students who may not have had any prior background in history. Right. And giving them the essentials so they can understand the conflict. So we have to frame it, but then looking at these very peculiar things like postcards or cartoons again, and other expressions of the horror or the fascination with war. And so we, for example, read a memoir by an Italian soldier, and it's a very dark memoir, but it's in fact surprisingly funny at the same time. And so students could, in fact, take on this memoir as they wished. Some found it extremely funny, some found it appalling, but they all had a way to express themselves based on what we were reading in that primary source.
Whether or not they had deep background in the context.
Exactly. And that's the challenge with the thematic courses, as you know, is to give them just the essentials so that they can take it on. And of course, we have some wonderful history majors who already have 2 or 3, even sometimes a half dozen courses under their belt, so they're fine to go. But it's for the sociology major, the science major, who will be taking this for their gen ed. This is what we want them we don't want them to walk away and say, oh my gosh, this was so difficult to grasp. We want them to grasp something and remember it.
That's right. One of the things I do on the first day of class in all my classes is talk about what those gen ed students have as their major. And then I convince them that the class that they're taking with me, whatever it is a course in their major, because their own field of study, their own methodology, their own preoccupations are somehow usable by historians, and the historian's perspective is always applicable to the accountant, to the biologist, to the religious studies person, to the business student.
That's a wonderful way of approaching it, by the way. I'm sometimes scared of a little bit because I say the moment you walk into my course, you are all historians. And so they sort of look at me with very suspicious eyes, and it's all right. We recover soon after.
Yes. I know that you we both just finished the first period fall session here, and you were teaching a course on the First World War. Was that in part inspired by the centennial of the Great War?
It was a combination of this and also the fact that I had done an independent study followed by an acre, and eventually my thesis with a student in the history department, Emily Durrell, who had focused on postcards. I inherited an old collection of postcards from my parents, and I said, since you're interested in communication, why don't you take a look at some of these? And so her hard work and her wonderful performance inspired me to actually think maybe we should do something in World War One. One of our former colleagues had introduced the course in World War II, but we didn't have anything for the centennial. So while I was away 2 years ago on sabbatical, I worked on developing that course. Of course, it got compressed, but I think it worked out.
Right. What sorts of readings did you end up using for that?
So that memoir I mentioned was one such thing, a very basic textbook, a reader. I wanted to do a little bit more by way of a few articles, but the compressed time sort of limited the opportunity. But we were able to do a little bit of primary sources by looking at some of these postcards in class, by thinking about poetry also. Notably, after the war, you have some incredibly powerful poems that come out of the Great Conflict by Siegfried Sassoon, among others. And so to invite the students, even those who are not interested in literature, to see how powerful a poem can be, and sometimes even more descriptive, more hard-hitting than a picture. And so we didn't have much time to go into it, but our last session we devoted to that.
Right. We have these various generational markers today, millennials and boomers and other people, but it may be the First World War and that notion of the lost generation that starts that identification of certain cohorts of a society by the events and by the period that they lived through.
Absolutely. And I think this is what probably hit them the hardest. I gave them examples of these incredible massacres that occurred in the war, in the Great War, more so than in World War II, by the way. And I explained to them, I reminded them that the men who passed away on the field were their age. And reminding them, for example, that the British one morning in 1916 lost more men than we lost in the Vietnam War over 15 years. Exactly. And so the trying to relate to an experience that is, of course, long gone. The last World War I survivor died in 2011. Is something that's very important to get them to relate. One thing I had not expected to include is, of course, the pandemic of 1918, which becomes particularly relevant. So we didn't talk too much about it, but it's still something that animates and is the background to the Paris Peace Talks in 1919. So we did discuss this a little bit, including poor President Wilson, who was taken with the flu.
Well, exactly. Yeah. An ill president and trying to continue his job despite his illness.
Yes.
You've taught a course on the space age as well.
That was the most fun. It was the first or maybe the second course that I was allowed to develop after I had started teaching all the other courses in the catalog. And it was interesting because it was still in the high time of the space shuttle. Initially, it was just an honors course, and we still had the right to simply drive the old biology department van. So I would take them down to Washington, D.C., so file 8 to 10 students in there, and
even less safe than the shuttle, I think.
I think so. Oh, we won't go there. Okay. But then go down to the Air and Space Museum and meet with a mentor of mine who's a curator there. And so they would get a personalized tour. They would understand what goes on in terms of conservation. And on a couple of occasions, we were lucky. I think the first or second time I taught it, there was actually a shuttle mission happening, and it was broadcast live right in the museum. So they got to, see a little bit more of what was going on. So it's carried on this way. I haven't taught it in 3 or 4 years. Hoping to do so again. Depends on demand. So, but it was a way for me to combine my interest in aviation and aerospace with sharing this interest with students without overwhelming them with technicalities, of course.
Exactly. Well, I think Air and Space is still got to be one of the most popular museums down at the Smithsonian.
It is. I think it's actually the most visited in the world. And this one second is natural history across the mall from it. So the Smithsonian does very well. Not right now, of course, because of the pandemic, but they're hoping to reopen next year.
Right. And certainly we're hoping to be able to take students on those field trips. We live in such a remarkable area, close to Philadelphia, close to New York, close to Washington, D.C., really a day trip back and forth to any of those places. And I think the only risky place, the risky place is the bus itself.
That's true. Absolutely. Yes.
And so once we can solve that problem,
Yes,
we'll look forward to taking advantage of our location here. And
that's true. In fact, I've been able to, every year I teach my course on the Holocaust, an advanced survey. I make an optional trip to the Holocaust Museum, and every student who chooses to go on it, I always ask at the end, is this something that you would recommend I plan? And systematically they all say yes. It's all they all derive a particular experience from it after having studied in the course for several weeks. So we don't start with that. In fact, we almost end with it. And it's a way for them to develop also a critical outlook on how museums present the past, understand things better. And of course, for some of them, see the museum for a couple hours and then enjoy the rest of Washington, D.C. before the bus trip home. We've all experienced that.
And that happens as well. No, but I've seen firsthand the effect of the Holocaust Museum on groups of students.
Absolutely.
And of course, we have an Albright grad who's an administrator now at Georgetown University and is a weekend volunteer at the National Memorial Holocaust Museum as well.
That's right. Sam. We both worked with, I remember.
We'll give a shout out to him on the Albright Scholar here. You've had some wonderful students over the year. Maybe you mentioned Marina just briefly, but maybe you should say something about a student who comes in as a costume design specialist and really very gifted in that field, and then her interest just grew and grew.
Absolutely, it's the beauty of teaching at Albright, is that you never know which student is going to walk in and express a further interest in what you are covering. And she became very interested in this 19th century Europe course, and I discussed the French Revolution, and all of a sudden something connected for her about how people dressed, because I mentioned that in the French Revolution, all of a sudden people started wearing pants as opposed to breeches. There was a class shift, basically, a revolution in itself. And she grew very interested in this, and she started studying it in greater detail, did a study on corsets as an independent project in the course itself for honors. And she ended up switching to the history major. She then worked with Hilary Kino, but she was also one of 25 students who presented at the American Historical Association in 2019. So competitively, she was right up there, and we're glad to have been able to send her to a good graduate school program. So the complete happenstance, but it was terrific to be able to work with her and also learn from her, because there are elements of fashion that I had no idea about.
Well, right, she had mad sewing skills and still does. So all that structure there not only means something culturally, but it means something on the body and
absolutely
what it does. Yeah. No,
and I have other students like that. Some of them develop their work into a full-fledged honors thesis. Some of them just want to explore something in particular. With one student about 4 or 5 years ago, we journeyed down to Washington, D.C. to take a look at archival materials pertaining to Nazi medicine and how it had been used in the United States. It didn't develop into an honors project, but the time we had together discovering these archival materials gave him, I think, a very good sense of what's out there also. And so that's the nice thing, is that we don't automatically focus on the honors student. We also take any student in to work with them and discover new things.
That's right. I know that I always find it gratifying when a student whose major is something else, and it may be biology, pre-dental, or something in business, but then they decide to take one history course and then another, because there's something about the topics or the way of approaching them that really speaks to students. Not what they're going to do for a living, but
yes, exactly.
But it helps them to live their lives.
I think in this way, it's also a way, I think, for you and me and our history colleagues also to reconcile them with the past. Many of them did not have a good high school experience.
No.
And so showing enthusiasm, trying to get them interested, redefining terms, not putting them down when they don't know what an ideology is, things like that, just welcoming them into the field, even if they've already had a course. That's something to continue to generate interest, but also their enthusiasm. Their enthusiasm helps us, so it's all good.
I think too that teaching history at the college level welcomes people to adulthood. When they're high school students, you know, the curriculum is in some sense, if not watered down, but there are whole areas of society that don't get comfortably talked about by school districts. But here, once you're 18, you're grown up, and we can address issues of politics and issues of religion and social conflict in a much more grown-up way.
Absolutely, and it's a balance I think we all have to maintain of challenging the student, introducing them to knowledge they assume they had, but in fact do not, or to invite them to actually open their mind to something that they may not agree with at all. In my first couple of years, I struggled to explain and convince of the necessity of talking about gay history, for example. Notably my Holocaust course, right? After all, gay men were among the first victims of the Nazis, not systematically like the Jews, but still. And over the years, I developed a greater experience in inviting them in so that students who may have a different view of LGBTQ+ will nonetheless listen as opposed to shutting down, which used to happen in my first couple of years here.
Have you found yourself getting wiser and wiser over the years?
I think less hair and more tummy.
Well,
yes.
certainly that, yeah. But I mean, you just mentioned that you become more comfortable, more adept at broaching certain subjects and speaking about them with greater self-assurance. And I think that probably makes you a better teacher then too.
I think I learn every class. I make mistakes all the time, but I try to learn from them, like we all do. It's generally it's for the better. I have made sometimes serious mistakes, but I think overall I've been able to also learn to let go about certain things. For example, you know, is it necessary that the student know every single, you know, last emperor of the Chinese dynasty? No, of course not. Let's just remember when the dynasty ended, and that will be sufficient. So there's understanding where they are coming from and what do we really want them to remember from the course, and also what they're bringing to it. It's fascinating to watch how much experience, in fact, they have and are willing to share. And so if we are patient enough, they will, in fact, volunteer some interesting stories and insights, including in written work. I love reading their papers, not necessarily for the grading, but simply because occasionally they'll have insights that I will take away myself.
Just discovering their ideas and, as you say, where they're coming from.
Yes, absolutely.
Their own thinking. One of the things I often tell my classes is that history has changed an awful lot in the last 50 years. I think members of the lay public imagine, if you're talking about the past, and particularly the past 100 or 200 years ago, that it's just there and it hasn't changed. But in fact, the historian's knowledge, perspective, scholarship have utterly transformed the past that we're seeing today, as opposed to in 1980 or 1960.
Oh, absolutely. The way you and I studied history is very different from the way we're teaching it, but the way they are studying it. I think it's actually fun sometimes to give them an insight or two. So, you know, in the ancient school survey I teach, you know, of course, we get to Mr. Caligula, the infamous emperor. And of course, they have his vision from, you know, dating back to the 60s. And of course, some notorious popular culture movies about him. And the reality is that the reinterpretation in the past decade or so shows, in fact, this man to have been incredibly intelligent, but also, you know, probably mad in the sense of depressed, but also so cynical because he realized there was no way he could do the job of emperor. And so introducing them to that, telling them, you know, think about it differently. This is not excusing the crimes of Caligula by any chance, but this is how we go about it. And some of them then take an interest in the character beyond what they think they know.
Yeah, good, good. But what's the best old book that you keep teaching, and what's the best new book that's come along, in really in any of your classes?
Oh my. The best old book is basically the first written story that I share with my colleagues in religious studies. It's the story of Gilgamesh, the great epic king. I teach the short version. It's an old 1960 translation, but it still works well. And it's an invitation to them to discover what is a hero. Um, and of course, you teach a course also on heroes and villains. I just stick to that for the Ancient Myth survey, and I have never been able to replace it.
Right.
It's something that is just constant. There will always be a new discovery for them, whether they try to relate to present heroes or to what it meant for the Sumerians to have someone they could admire and respect, and who was not a god.
Yeah.
As far as best books that have come along, oh, there's too many to cite. The challenge for me is, say, this is such a great book. Can it work with my students? And I would say that in terms of very recent books, unfortunately, their length prevents me from assigning the books. I will say that in my Holocaust survey, I continue to assign Ordinary Man by Christopher Browning, which is now almost 30 years old. It came out in 1992. And it's a way to understand, without excusing, of course, the behavior of Germans who killed Jews. But it is done in a very simple narrative form, and it does not get too detailed. And this is the key thing. We want students to be able to apprehend the past without getting bogged down in the leaves. And if they want to dig deeper, similar books exist. They're about 500 pages, but we'll stay away from those for the
That's
moment.
right. Fresh scholarship is often written by people who have something to prove, and it takes them many, many hundreds of pages to prove it.
Absolutely, yes. Short is sweet, I keep telling them.
Brilliant and brief.
Yes.
Are there books that used to work well in, say, 1996 and don't work so well anymore?
There are, I would say, notably, I mean, textbooks in particular, some have really sort of gone out of style and in a way that has surprised me. Um, there are some short monographs. I can't think off the top of my head of what they are, but I know that I've stopped assigning them because they simply did not work with the times that we are now in.
Right.
Even sometimes cultural references no longer work. So when I teach my course on the space program, any reference to Star Trek has to go. I learned this about 10 years ago when one of my advisees, as I was making a Star Trek reference, looked at me and said, "Oh, you poor person, you." So
I know some Trekkies. Oh, they're 60 years old.
exactly. If I still want to do a couple of Star Wars reference like our colleague Dr. Keister, I think I'd be okay. But I know the basics, but I don't know a lot. So
right, yeah. So, in that case, buffs know more than we do.
exactly.
Well, we've mentioned this compressed setup we have now with 7-week semesters, and it's really a pressure cooker, certainly for us, and I think for our students as well. But so far, we've been, I think, careful enough to avoid a major flare-up of COVID here on campus. And maybe I should knock on my desk here.
I got wood here too.
Okay. So we will see. We're going to be teaching up until Thanksgiving, and then give our exams in early December, and then be off for a little while. We'll have I guess a 6-week rather than a 3.5-week interim, and then start up school again in February.
That's right. It's going to be a challenge, but we'll take it on. The difficulty, I think, with those modules is that we don't get a chance to know our students well enough. I mean, in fact, the way we concluded is essentially we're at midterms. This is when, in fact, we really begin to know each other.
Find out what their style of thinking is, what their own interests are, what their life experience has been. I know.
Absolutely. Although, obviously, in the compressed format, we see them daily. So sometimes we are able to, in fact, make a connection much faster. Some are shy all the time.
A couple of my colleagues in some fields have felt comfortable with it. In theater, for example, every day, that kind of works in the theater.
That's true. I agree.
Whereas in history, it'd be nice to have people do some reading and thinking in between classes.
That's right. Give them a little breathing space.
Okay. Well, we could express our wishes for a safe and healthy future all day long. But we're just about at the end of our time together. But it really has been a lovely conversation and great to catch up with what I know and what I've learned today, and then also share it with our viewers. So,
well, thank you for having me on board, John. I really appreciate it.
Guillaume, merci bien.
À la prochaine.
Oui, à lundi.